Welcome back to Sika Strength. Welcome back to Sika Stan. Today we're talking about linear progression. So, over the past 12 years of coaching strength athletes, we have gotten this question recurring over and over again. When I start lifting weights or as I begin a strength training program, when should I stop doing linear progression, or when is linear progression no longer applicable to my particular case? So, let's take a look at linear progression first. Linear progression, generally speaking, is a progression of intensity as you go through a training block. In the most basic form, when we look at linear progression for beginners, they will do something like 5x5 on a back squat. They'll do it twice per week, and then they'll make a very incremental increase in loading. So 2.5 kilo increase from Monday to Friday to Monday to Friday, and they continue on that course. Now, as we all know, we can't keep doing this forever. You're not going to squat 300 kilos by just doing 5x5 and adding 2.5 kilos each week. This would mean that everybody would have 400 kilo back squats very, very quickly. So obviously we know linear progression at a certain stage will stop us progressing. Now, what we're going to talk about today is some of the more intricate measures when we're looking at linear progression and how that actually relates to our general coaching models. When we look at some of the most popular or some of the most notorious programming in the world, we will see linear progression repeatedly popping up. So whether it's an increase in actual intensity, in the case of strength sports, we'll use loading on the barbell as intensity, or maybe we'll increase intensity through shorter rest periods or more speed or an increase in difficulty. But we can also do linear progression with things like volume, with things like frequency of the lifts throughout the week, and all of these will be pushing us in a linear direction. Now, linear progression is a misused term. Generally speaking, we'll only think about the most fundamental form of linear progression, but when we actually look at standard programming protocols, standard periodized models of training, linear progression underlies all of those methods of progressing our back squat, our front squat, our deadlift, our sprint times, our running volume. Whatever it is, we are linearly progressing. Let's take a look at one of these very popular models. This is an internet version of the Russian squat program. Now, you'll see on the Russian squat program what commonly happens. We are squatting 3 times per week, and it's a notoriously difficult program. So in this case, we squat 3 times a week. The loads actually remain quite similar for the first number of weeks or for numerous sessions in a row, and we linearly progress the volume. Now, in almost every case we hear of people running the Russian squat program, they have 2 outcomes. Either they get a massive increase in squat, or else they get injured and fall out of the program. Now, the unfortunate element behind linear progression and behind the steadfast rules of linear progression is that there comes a point where your adaptation curve cannot meet the progression scale we expect from the program. Now, what might this look like? Well, maybe I start off on week 1 with 3 sets of 5 at 75% of 1 rep max. Now, this is a very, very standard approach to starting training. We know most people in reasonably good shape can hit 75% of 1 rep max for 5 sets of 5 reps. In this case, we start just below that, 3 sets of 5. That will be our week 1 or session 1 of squatting. Moving on from there, it's very common that we would then go to 5 sets of 5 at 75% of 1 rep max. This is bringing us to pretty much a baseline pace where we know we could have hit this on week 1, but week 1 we've done some prep and now we should definitely be able to hit it. Now, where do we go from here? So a very common thing to do from here would be stick with 5x5, maybe add 2.5%, so go to 77.5, or maybe we'll add 2.5 kilos. That will have a different outcome depending on what our 1RM is. Now, a slightly better option here in this case is to accumulate a bit more volume. And this is the problem with most linear progression models, is that in most cases, we only look at linearly progressing our intensity and not actually building volume over the course of our 2-month or 3-month or 4-month training block. So rather than going from 3x5 to 5x5, and then continuing at 5x5s, what we should probably be doing here is a small fluctuation. And in our opinion, definitely at the beginning of a training block, we want to be getting more reps in. So go from your 3x5 to 5x3. Maybe then we'll look at 4x8. Maybe then we'll look at 4x6, and all of these will slowly build up the total amount of volume we're doing in a training session. Now, the other advantage with doing this is we don't do something that we refer to as running out of room. So if I start a training block at 80% of 1 rep max and I know I want to be training for 16 weeks, then I obviously can't do a 2.5 kilo or 2.5% increase from week to week, because in that case I would be at 110 or 120% of 1 rep max very, very quickly. And as we all know, that doesn't work out too well. So we've talked about our mode or our method of progression now. It's very obvious in power sports, in strength sports, we always think about intensity. The volume then becomes the next obvious step after that. So more reps, more sets. But what we can also do is start looking at alternative methods of progression that aren't necessarily the intensity, aren't necessarily the volume, and so fall outside of that bracket that we'd refer to as volume load. Now, the next place we tend to go for in strength sports is we'll tend to make those individual sets a bit more difficult. So when we're just looking at volume as the marker, or we're just looking at volume load as the marker, we come up against the background that 3 sets of 10 is not the same as doing a set of 30. So that individual working set difficulty is a very, very valid form of progression. And so if I was to do something like 5 sets of 3 and then make that 3 sets of 5, I have a training session with identical volume load, but now that training session and those individual sets become more difficult. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm bringing up a number of variables. The first thing I'm doing is I'm really increasing my work capacity. So obviously, if I take a lot of rest and do 10 singles, I won't be that out of breath afterwards. If I do 1 set of 10 without any of that rest, without re-racking the barbell in between, I'm going to build a lot more work capacity. And for you as a strength training athlete, this should be one of those major markers that you're looking to progress as you go through a training cycle. So let's say that again, 3x5, then I go to 5x5. Now, the next thing I can do here is I can look at going 2 sets of 8. I'm slowly building that up, but the individual working sets are more difficult. I'm gaining more work capacity, and I'm gaining more of that motor cognitive skill of maintaining my brace under fatigue. I don't necessarily have to be having a very heavy weight on my back for that weight to feel incredibly difficult. Another form of linear progression that we rarely think about in strength sports, but is regularly thought about in the sport of weightlifting, is the exercise selection and the manipulation of that exercise selection to make the complex or make that working set more difficult, so gaining intensity in the session. Now, a classic case here would be a snatch complex where, say, we do 2 snatches plus 2 overhead squats. In every case, it's very clear to see going from 1 plus 1 on this complex to 2 plus 1 or 2 plus 2 will increase the volume of that. But now if we just look at that same set, but manipulate 1 or 2 of those variables, so maybe we go to snatch plus snatch balance, makes it a bit more difficult again. Maybe instead of going to 2 plus 2 on snatch plus overhead squat, we would go for 2 snatches plus 1 snatch balance plus 1 overhead squat. This makes this inherently more difficult, and I make that clear and obvious linear progression or clear and obvious progression as we go from session to session. Now, what I'd really like you to think about as you're looking at your own programming, as you're looking at your own training, is that you should have multiple modes or multiple ways of progressing over the course of the entire block. So if you're sitting down, you're on week 0 and you're trying to write out 8 weeks of programming, obviously we want to be making progress in terms of our volume and in terms of our intensity. Maybe we slightly increase volume at the beginning of the block and then taper that volume off at the end. So what would that look like in contrast with our intensity? Maybe as we build volume, that intensity remains the same. And then as we slowly decrease the volume, that intensity will increase over the course of my 8 weeks, 16 weeks, 12, 15 weeks of training, however long it is. But what we should also be looking to do is look for those alternative methods. This will allow us to ensure we're constantly making progress. We're constantly taking 2 steps forward and maybe only 1 step back with those training sessions. And it will keep me on that road of progress for far, far longer. I can already hear people saying, look, I'm just starting off with strength training. This is my 2nd year of training or 1st year of lifting weights. I'm making progress no matter what I do. And that is absolutely true. If we get a beginner in, maybe they're in their first 2 or 3 years of training, we can pretty much give them any programming and they will do very well. They'll make progress because they're coming from a very low start point. Now, is that necessarily the best thing for them to do? Well, what I would say is absolutely not. So when we think about lifting weights, when we think about training, we should really be thinking about it as a stimulus. It is a means, it's a function to get something out at the end of it. Now, just because we have a very simple means or we have a very crude means that we don't have to think about all that much, doesn't necessarily mean we should be doing it. And certainly it doesn't mean we're going to get the same results at the end. So where the beginner might do 8 weeks of squatting twice per week, doing 5 by 5 on each session and making those incremental increases, sure, they're going to clearly make improvements on their squat. They'll clearly gain some work capacity. They'll clearly or hopefully hit a nice PB at the end of it. But if we were to do a more refined form of linear progression, possibly building up some work capacity at the start with a linear model, then possibly building up some intensity midway through with a linear model, both of these are still utilizing those theories or those principles of linear progression, but you'll get much more bang for your buck out of it at the end of the training block. Now, there are other reasons you should be doing slightly more intelligent programming models than just getting better outcomes. So the first thing we tend to see is that movement quality overall will be improved. Now, there's a couple of reasons that this will be improved. The first reason, obviously, is when we gain a bit more volume in the beginning phase of a training program, we get more practice with the barbell. That motor cognition element comes into it more. We gain those motor skills far more quickly because, relatively speaking, the intensity is lower and we have more reps to practice with. Now, the other thing we get as we go through a slightly more refined model is that we get far more enjoyable training sessions in. So I'm going through different modes or I'm going through different elements of training. Maybe at some of the weeks we're doing those real high rep ones that cost a lot in terms of our aerobic values. Maybe as we get later on in the program, we get to touch those heavier weights more frequently, thus getting more practice with the heavier weights. But also, I have a slightly different cognitive load going on in training sessions, and those training sessions then tend to be far more enjoyable than then just coming into the gym for the 20th time in a row, doing essentially the same session and becoming bored of it midway or halfway through. Now, the final thing I would say with a slightly more refined linear progression model is that you make progress for far, far longer. So we'll constantly get athletes coming to us saying they've been lifting for a few years, made great progress in the start, then they plateaued and they slowly start to enjoy training a lot less. And then they might have changed something or they'll be reaching out to somebody to get better programming. The brass tacks of it when it comes down to it is that making long-term progress takes a small bit more than just simply pounding weight onto the bar every single time we come in. These better models, this better way of programming allows us to make progress after 5 years, after 10 years, after 15 years of training, and then we don't have to constantly be having this thought in our head of, I haven't PB'd in 2 months, I haven't PB'd in 6 months, I haven't PB'd in 12 months, and then maybe at some point that leading to us no longer lifting weights. So I hope you found this video enjoyable. I hope you found it informative. If there's questions similar to this that you'd like us to answer, this question came from feedback from somebody in the comment section of one of our previous videos. So comment down below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. We'd love to hear if you have more questions like this. Also, if you'd like to see some of our programming, the best thing you could do, check out the Sika Strength app. You'll get a 7-day free trial. All you have to do is cancel your subscription by the end of that 7 days and you're not charged. This will allow you to take a look through the programs, take a look at some of those progression models we talk about, and hopefully make better progress because you make use of one of those programs. As always, we're available at sikastrength.com or email us at sikastrength@gmail.com, and thanks for watching.